Snow roared like a living thing as Queen Elara stood on the shattered balcony. Ice veined across the stones, as if the castle itself were bleeding cold. Lucas said, "Do not take another step." His breath smoked in the air. She lifted a hand, and the blizzard bowed, wild and obedient. Lord Varyn said, "Choose Elara, your crown or his heart." The words struck like iron. The night sky cracked with auroras that hissed like serpents. A memory flashed, a kiss stolen in a frost garden. Elara said, "I will not be mastered." A runt of fear skittered through her resolve. Lucas moved closer, coat snapping in the gale. The ice below him moaned and split. Varyn smiled, a blade of light in his palm. The castle bells told a warning no one heeded. Elara's power surged, blue and furious. She felt love and terror collide like storms. The choice rose before her like a cliff. She stepped into it. Dawn crawled over the mountains and the castle exhaled a tired hush. The storm had passed, leaving knives of sunlight in the snow. Elara walked the silent corridor where portraits stared coldly. Lucas said, "You should rest." She ignored the ache in her bones. The bells lay cracked like shells. She thought of the garden and the almost kiss. Mira Thorn waited in the library, with a candle guttering. Mira said, "Power asks a price, child." Elara flinched at the word, child. Lucas lingered, hands folded, not trusting peace. A draft moved like a ghost across the floor. Elara said, "Varyn knows something I do not." The words tasted of iron. She felt the court's whispers hiding in the walls. Lucas said, "You are not alone." The promise warmed and frightened her. She kept walking, because stopping meant sinking. The mountain kept its old secrets. In the library, smoke from the hearth braided with the scent of wet parchment. Shelves leaned like old soldiers. Mira spread a cracked atlas and tapped a sigil of winter fire. Mira said, "Your mother bound the north with mercy." Elara felt the room tilt. She had chased power, not mercy. Lucas stood near the door, as if guarding the threshold. Elara said, "Varyn spoke of a choice." The candle guttered and spat. Mira said, "There's a bond older than your crown." The atlas flared pale blue along a hidden line. Lucas said, "If there is a bond, we will bear it." The words steadied her. Elara traced the line and felt it shiver like a living vein. Somewhere a bell fragment chimed. Wind pressed at the shutters, and then withdrew. The truth waited with patient teeth. They descended to the chapel where ice flowers grew from broken tiles. Light fell in bars from stained glass saints. Elara's breath slowed as the silence thickened. Lucas said, "He will come again." The words hovered like ravens. Elara knelt and pressed her palm to the altar stone. A tremor answered, old and gentle. She saw a vision of the mountain, opening like a jaw. "Mira," said, "the vow lies beneath." Steps led into a crypt mouth rimmed with rhyme. Elara said, "If I take the vow, I bind my heart." Her voice did not tremble. Lucas said, "Your heart is already brave." Heat rose along her throat and faded. The saints seemed to watch with tired mercy. She stood, and the ice flowers chimed. Night returned with a quiet that felt sharpened. Elara stepped onto the ramparts where the world dropped away in silver. The wind smelled of iron and pine. Lucas said, "If he forces a duel, I stand." She wanted to say, "Do not." She said instead, "We choose together." Stars burned like watching eyes. Far below, torches moved where Varyn's scouts prowled. A lone bell note shivered through the stone. Elara said, "He thinks love is a lever." Thought cracked and bled. Lucas said, "Let him learn, it is an anchor." She breathed, and the air froze into tiny halos. Somewhere, an old wolf howled and was answered. She felt the cliff edge inside her retreat one step. One step. The night held, bracing for the next blow. The castle woke shivering, and Elara measured her steps by the hush of the halls. Her fingers skimmed the frost that grew like script along the stone. Lucas said, "Sleep is a mercy you refuse." She wanted to answer and did not trust the shape of the words. Mira lit herbs and the smoke curled in thin blue threads. Mira said, "Name the wound so it stops owning you." Elara remembered a cradle of winter where love was forbidden by law and fear. Lucas stood close enough to be a promise and not a prison. Elara said, "If I want him safe, I must be colder than a grave." The truth tasted like metal, and she swallowed it whole. Wind pawed at the shutters and left its mark in a soft moan. Mira said, "Mercy keeps heat alive where power cannot." Elara set her palm on the wall and felt the mountain answer. Lucas said, "I choose you even when storms are choosing me." A smile caught on her mouth and melted before it could fall. She breathed and let the cold pass through without stealing her heart. Somewhere the bells dreamed of gentler winters. Snowlight glazed the training court and the air flowed white with breath. Mira drew a circle of ash and motioned Elara inside it. Mira said, "Power is a river, not a cage." Elara let the chill lift from her skin like a second soul. Lucas watched from the arch with hands clenched and jaw gentle. Elara said, "When I reach for calm, I find winter teeth." Mira walked the circle and scattered sparks that died as frost. Mira said, "Name a warmth you trust." Elara closed her eyes and found a memory of rough wool and quiet laughter. Lucas said, "I am here even when you shut the door." The ice underfoot sang in a thin silver key. Elara opened her hand, and the song softened until it was almost a lullaby. A faint halo rose and drifted like snow that had learned to float. Her shoulders loosened, and the ache behind her ribs eased. Mira said, "Hold that, and the mountain will hold you back." Elara breathed until heat and cold agreed to share the room. Lucas stepped nearer, and the ash line quivered but did not break. Elara said, "If love is my anchor, will it drown me?" Lucas said, "Only if you let go when the wave lifts." The answer settled like a cloak that finally fit. Afternoon light thinned to pearl as Elara sorted torn petitions on a frostbitten table. The ink bled where snow had kissed it. Lucas said, "These people write to a queen and to a woman." The word woman startled her like a bird in a chapel. She read a line about a sick child and felt her pulse stutter. Elara said, "I cannot be winter if I cannot be warm." Wind rattled the panes and shook a powder of ice onto the page. Lucas brushed the flakes away with careful fingers. Elara thought of a life where duty and tenderness were not rivals. Mira stood in the doorway and did not interrupt the fragile hush. Mira said, "A crown weighs less when two shoulders bear it." Elara smiled without showing teeth, and the room brightened a shade. Lucas said, "Let us answer them with bread and with fire." The plan woke like an ember under ash. Elara wrote, and the quill did not scratch so harshly. She sealed the first decree and felt something unfreeze and move. The mountain hummed as if it heard a new name spoken softly. Lucas said, "We will carry it to the gates before night." Elara nodded, and the fear inside her learned a smaller shape. Evening poured indigo into the courtyard, and torches stitched a ring of amber. Elara sat on the well lip and watched steam rise from the bucket like a tame ghost. Lucas said, "Tell me what you keep behind your crown." She almost laughed and almost cried. Elara said, "My mother taught me to freeze pain before it spoke." The memory cut clean and left her steady. Lucas stood beside her and his shadow crossed her boots. Elara said, "I learned to lock doors faster than I learned to open them." Wind passed over the stones and carried a scent of pine pitch. Lucas said, "Doors are for choosing, not for hiding forever." Stars shivered in the bucket and made a small sky she could hold. Elara reached and touched his sleeve as if testing water. He did not move away, and the world did not shatter. Mira watched from a window with a look that was almost peace. The castle listened like an elder who had waited long. Elara breathed and found that breath could be gentler than power. She said, "If I choose warmth, I must choose it every hour." Lucas said, "Then we will choose it every hour together." Night gathered close, and the crypt door breathed cold into their faces. Mira held a lamp that painted honey on the ice. Elara traced the vow rune carved into the threshold and felt it stir. Mira said, "This binds your heart to mercy before it binds it to rule." The words should have frightened her, and instead, they steadied her bones. Lucas said, "Whatever it asks, I will stand beside you." Elara said, "I will not trade love for power." The rune brightened like dawn trapped under glass. Wind prowled at the far stairs, and then went quiet. Mira chanted the old lines, and her voice made the air ring. Elara pressed her palm and let the mountain measure her truth. Heat rose from the stone as if a hearth had learned to breathe. Lucas said, "You are not alone in this winter." A tremor moved through the crypt, and the frost flowers opened. Elara felt the vow take hold and leave her lighter. She lifted her hand, and the light went with her like a gentle star. She turned, and Lucas caught her gaze without fear. Outside, a bell gave one soft note and did not break. Dawn sharpened to a blade as smoke rose from the village below. Elara watched roofs blister under blue fire and felt the mountain flinch. Lucas said, "This is Varyn's handwriting." Fear tried to scale her ribs and failed. Mira said, "He tests the vow by burning mercy to ash." Elara raised her hand and the wind bent, waiting like a trained hound. She said, "We answer with shelter first and steel after." Lucas nodded, eyes dark with stormlight. Riders thudded through the gate, dragging soot on their boots. A boy coughed sparks that were only dust and grief. Mira said, "Open the granaries and the cistern." Elara felt power lean toward rage, and she leaned it toward care. Lucas said, "I will ride the lower road and cut his supply vein." She said, "You ride, I hold." The bells gave one hard note that did not crack. By noon, the great hall ran on triage and command. Elara paced between cots as melted snow tapped a tired rhythm. Lucas said, "Scouts saw Varyn's banner near the ravine." She pictured the dagger that smoked in winter and did not blink. Mira said, "There is talk of a traitor wearing borrowed faces." The word traitor folded the air. Elara said, "Find the leak without tearing the skin." A healer sobbed once and then stitched a wound steady as prayer. The door sighed and a courier dropped to a knee. Lucas said, "He starves the road and feeds the fear." Elara set maps like shields and traced the supply bones. She said, "We cut here and we feed there." Mira marked the granary keys and slipped one into Elara's palm. The key felt like a promise that could not be broken by frost. Afternoon bled thin as Lucas led a lean column along the lower road. Pines pressed close like listening soldiers. A rider with a white scarf signaled once and vanished. Lucas said, "They want us blind before dusk." He cut the pace and watched the ravine's black mouth open. Arrows hissed and died in shields. He said, "Break in pairs and take the ridge." The ridge answered with ice that did not hold easily. A figure stepped from fog wearing a familiar stance. Lucas said, "Seren." The name carried grief and anger like twins. "Wall." Seren said, "Turn back before your queen freezes what she loves." Lucas held the road like a vow he refused to drop. He said, "I will not hand her to your ghosts." The fog took the rest of the sentence and kept it. Twilight found Elara in the chapel, with maps spread like wounds. The candles guttered and then bent as if someone breathed them. A maid stepped from the shadow and wore Mira's face too well. Elara said, "Names are hard to steal." The maid smiled with a mouth that did not belong. Nick said, "Faces serve where truth refuses." The room stretched thin and then snapped to size. Elara said, "What does Varyn pay for borrowed skin?" Nick said, a promise to cut the bond at your heart. The candles steadied because fear refused to show. Elara said, "Tell him mercy will break his blade." Nyx flickered between three faces and settled on her own. She was young and tired and sharper than any knife. Elara lifted her hand and Frost wrote a warning in the air that did not need words. Night crashed hard, and Lucas faced Seren on the ridge where wind screamed. Snow streamed like sparks off steel. Seren said, "I bled for that crown until it bled me back." Lucas said, "Then bleed no more for a tyrant." Seren laughed, and it sounded like broken glass. Below, Varyn's fires made a cruel necklace in the dark. Lucas said, "Elara chose mercy, and it did not make her weak." Seren said, "Mercy made me easy to break." They met, and the clash rang like struck bells. Lucas slipped, found balance, and pressed. Seren knocked him to a knee and paused, as if memory gripped his wrist. Lucas said, "Help me cut his hands from your throat." The pause held like ice over deep water, and then cracked. Dawn cracked, with a silence heavier than storm. Elara walked the ramparts and counted fires in the valley, each one a threat spelled in flame. Lucas said, "Seren did not strike true." She felt the pause in his blade echo like unfinished song. Mira said, "The past drags chains on every wrist." Elara closed her eyes and saw the vow rune burning brighter than blood. She said, "Secrets are coiled too deep in these walls." The mountain exhaled a groan that rattled Frost loose. Lucas touched her shoulder and said, "Whatever truth waits, we face it unbroken." Elara thought of Nyx's stolen faces and the taste of deception. She said, "I will not let shadows write my story." The bells did not move, yet a low hum rippled through their iron as if they listened. In the library's hush, Nyx leaned against the window, her face flickering as though memory rewrote her skin. Elara said, "Truth is the mask you refuse to wear." Nyx smiled, weary and sharp. Nyx said, "I was his shadow before I was my own." Mira frowned and closed the atlas with a snap. She said, "Varyn binds with chains unseen." Nyx's eyes softened for a heartbeat, and then froze over. Elara said, "If you know the blade that cuts him, speak it." Nyx said, "The bond you cherish is his snare." The words iced the air. Lucas said, "Then we shatter snares with stronger knots." Elara's chest tightened, part fear, part defiance. She said, "If my heart is the key, I choose where it turns." The crypt swallowed their voices as they descended into its throat. Runes pulsed faintly, blue veins under stone skin. Elara pressed her palm to one and felt it quicken like a heartbeat. Mira said, "This is the vow's root." Lucas stepped closer, torch painting him in gold and shadow. He said, "What grows from it?" Elara whispered, "A chain or a wing." The stone shifted, revealing a carved mural of her mother, crown heavy, eyes hollow. Mira said, "She bound herself to silence for peace." Elara trembled, torn between pride and grief. She said, "I will not seal myself away." The rune flared, splitting light across their faces. Night smothered the valley, and the enemy's drums echoed against stone. On the ridge, Seren faced Lucas again, torchlight clawing his scar. Seren said, "She carries your ruin in her chest." Lucas raised his blade and said, "She carries my reason." Seren's laugh cracked, part sorrow, part fury. He said, "Varyn promised to free me from her shadow." Lucas struck and sparks sang. Seren caught the blow but faltered, eyes haunted by memory. Lucas said, "You are not his slave unless you choose." Seren's blade trembled as if his hand warred with itself. Back in the chapel, Elara stood before the altar, frost climbing the saints' faces. Nyx lingered at the door, shadows crawling at her feet. Nyx said, "He will come when your heart is bare." Elara turned and said, "Then let him come." She raised her hand, and the stained glass cracked, light flooding in shards of color. Mira whispered, This is the turning. Lucas entered, armor marked with Seren's hesitation, but eyes fierce. He said, "Whatever breaks, we mend together." Elara stepped into the storm of colors, crown gleaming cold fire. She said, "Then let truth find me unyielding." The mountain held its breath as Varyn's army climbed in black waves. From the ramparts, Elara watched the torches snake upward like veins of fire. Lucas said, "They will strike before dawn." His voice was iron wrapped in dread. Mira said, "The vow will test more than flesh." Elara gripped the frost crown until it bit her palm. She said, "If love is my anchor, then it is also my weapon." The sky muttered with thunder, though no storm brewed. Nyx whispered from the shadows, "He will tear open what you cherish most." Elara turned, her eyes cold flame. She said, "Then he will learn the price of daring it." Bells groaned as if waking for war, their iron song heavy with omen. In the lower court, refugees pressed close, their breath clouds weaving a fog of fear. Elara moved among them with a steady pace, her touch leaving trails of frost that warmed instead of burned. A child said, "Will the fire eat us?" Her throat tightened, but she smiled. She said, "Fire bends when winter stands." Lucas watched, his eyes softened against the edge of battle. Mira said, "They need to see a queen who carries more than steel." Elara lifted a boy into her arms, and the hall brightened, though no torch grew stronger. Nyx leaned against a pillar, her face unreadable. Elara said, "Hope is harder to break than stone." The refugees echoed her words as if they were a shield. On the ridge, Seren stood apart, his sword drawn but his spirit torn. Varyn's banner cracked above him like lightning. Seren said, "I have no place in their mercy." Lucas approached with blade sheathed. He said, "You have a place if you claim it." Seren's scarred face twisted with guilt. He said, "Mercy broke me once." Lucas said, "Then let it mend you now." The army's drums thundered, pressing the choice sharp against his chest. Seren closed his eyes, and the memory of Elara's kindness flared like fragile fire. He lifted his sword not at Lucas, but at the dark tide. He said, "Then I fight to unbreak what I shattered." The chapel doors burst wide with stormlight, Varyn stepping inside, cloak gleaming with frost that obeyed him. He said, "Your heart is the chain that weakens you." Elara stood at the altar, crown flaring. She said, "It is the fire that keeps me standing." His smile cut sharp. He raised the dagger, its light humming like venom. Nyx shifted by the doorway, her face pale with hesitation. Mira whispered, "This is the knife's shadowed truth." Lucas rushed to Elara's side, sword gleaming. Varyn said, "Love is a leash." Elara's power surged, filling the chapel with shards of frozen light. She said, "Love is the storm you cannot cage." The stained glass cracked wider and poured fire-colored light across them all. Midnight fell heavy as battle thundered outside. In the crypt beneath the chapel, Elara traced the vow rune again, its light trembling. Lucas said, "You cannot bind yourself alone." She said, "If I fail, mercy dies." Seren limped down the stairs, blood marking his cloak. He said, "Then let me stand where I once fell." Mira's voice wove a chant that shook dust from the ceiling. Nyx pressed her palm beside Elara's, and the rune flared brighter. Varyn's roar echoed above, rattling the stones. Elara said, "Then let the vow be carried by all who choose." The rune split open, spilling light that climbed like dawn. She felt the bond knit them together, not as chains but as roots deep enough to weather storm and fire. Night pressed like iron as the siege line surged and roared below the walls. Elara stepped onto the broken balcony and felt the vow thrum against her ribs. Lucas said, "The western gate buckles." The words were clean and hard. Mira said, "Hold breath with the mountain and let fear pass." The bells answered with a low, steady hymn. Elara said, "If he breaks us, he breaks mercy first." The thought cut and steadied. Torches crawled uphill like vipers hunting heat. Nick said, his shapewalkers prowl inside our shadow. The admission stung but did not shake her spine. Seren limped from the stair with blood drying black. Seren said, "Give me the ridge, and I will buy you dawn." Elara faced the night, and felt love settle like armor. She said, "Dawn will find us standing, or find no one at all." Varyn strode through the chapel doors, and the wind crawled at his heels like tamed wolves. He said, "A queen who loves is a blade with a soft spine." Elara met his eyes and did not blink. She said, "A heart is steel that remembers warmth." Stained glass trembled and sang in brittle color. Lucas said, "Step away from her." His stance wrote refusal across the floor. Varyn raised the dagger and winter hissed along its edge. Mira moved with a prayer that tasted of old salt and ash. Nick slipped between pillars and unmade a shapewalker with a twist. Varyn said, "Yield the bond and I spare the man." The lie smelled of iron and rot. Elara said, "I choose him and all who stand in my circle." The vow brightened like dawn behind stone. The ridge howled as Seren met the black tide with a broken line and a burning will. He said, "Hold until the mountain remembers us." Arrows tore the air and died in shields. Lucas split from the gate with riders like sparks blown uphill. Lucas said, "Cut the supply vein and fold the flank." The order turned chaos into teeth. Below, Varyn's siege ladders crawled like stiff spiders. Elara stood on the wall and poured calm through fear until it softened. She said, "Mercy, hold our hands steady and power, take the weight." Mira lit braziers that sang with blue fire. Nyx ghosted along the parapet and unstitched false faces. The night bent, but it did not break. Dawn began as a rumor moving under the snow. Varyn climbed the final stair with frost breaking from his boots like shattered glass. He said, "Your mother bartered silence and called it peace." The word struck deep and tried to rot. Elara tasted the old ache and did not swallow it. She said, "I break the bargain and keep the world." The dagger hummed until the rafters shook. Lucas said, "You will not touch her." His blade met Varyn's light and screamed. Mira cried, "Remember the vow," and the crypt stones answered with a hum. Nyx said, "He hides a second knife in his left sleeve." The warning cut the moment clean. Elara stepped through fear, as if through a torn banner. She said, "Release your hand from my people's throat." The aurora tore open above the chapel like a living wound. The vow awakened and poured like blue fire from the crypt to the sky. Elara placed her palm on the altar and felt 1,000 hands join hers. She said, "We stand as one body and one breath." The walls sang until dust fell like pale rain. Varyn struck, quick as regret, and found Lucas already there. Lucas said, "You do not decide our ending." Steel met light, and neither bowed. Mira braided the chant into a scaffold that would not fail. Nyx cut the second knife from Varyn's sleeve and flung it into frost. Seren's horn called from the ridge, clear as morning. Elara said, "Love is not your leash, it is our strength." The vow surged and broke his blade into bright snow. Silence followed, wide and holy, and then the bells began to ring. The bells rang until the mountain shook, but their echo softened into a hush. Elara stood among the ruin of the chapel, vow light fading into embers. Lucas said, "The blade is broken, but the scar remains." She touched his cheek and felt warmth through the frost. Mira said, "The vow binds without chains, and the bond lives as root not rope." Nyx leaned against a shattered pillar, her face shadowed with tired defiance. Nyx said, "Varyn is not ashes yet. He lingers where wounds bleed longest." Seren entered, limping, cloak torn and horn silent. Seren said, "The ridge holds, but it costs too much." Elara's chest ached with weight and mercy. She said, "We count the living, we carry the lost, and we learn to breathe again." Dawn broke pale as the villagers gathered in the courtyard, their faces hollow but unbroken. Elara stepped forward and their whispers hushed like snow falling. She said, "Mercy is not weakness, it is the marrow of strength." The crowd leaned closer, their eyes catching light. Lucas said, "She stood for us, now we stand for her." The words turned whispers into a chorus. Mira raised her staff and said, "The vow belongs to all who breathe under its sky." Nyx shifted in the crowd, still unsure, but her gaze softened. Seren watched from the edge, burdened and seeking redemption in silence. Elara lifted her crown high and sunlight caught the ice, scattering colors over them like blessings. By midday the hall filled with maps and voices, yet Elara's heart lingered on silence. Lucas leaned over the table, his hand brushing hers. Lucas said, "This fight will echo, but we decide its song." She said, "We will build a world where love stands before fear." Mira marked new lines with steady chalk. Mira said, "Roots grow deeper when storms tear branches." Nyx stepped from the shadow and placed stolen sigils on the table. Nyx said, "These are his last masks. Without them he is only a man." Seren said nothing, only bent his head in heavy shame. Elara touched the maps and said, "Then we write tomorrow not with war, but with mercy." Evening settled with bruised light over the mountain. Elara walked the frost garden where roses slept in crystal cages. Lucas joined, his coat brushing hers. He said, "Do you fear the vow will bind you too tightly?" She looked at him and said, "I fear nothing that asks me to love." He touched her frost crown, careful, reverent. She said, "My mother gave silence, but I give voice." The garden wind carried scents of pine and iron softened by snow. Lucas said, "Then let this be our vow, spoken, not hidden." Their breath mingled and warmed the cold air. For a moment, the frost roses glimmered as if spring stirred beneath them. Night returned, quiet but alive with promise. Elara stood once more on the balcony, the valley below no longer burning but hushed under stars. Lucas said, "The scar of battle will fade, but not what we built." She said, "Love does not fade, it endures like stone and sky." Mira's candle flickered behind them, her prayer silent. Nyx leaned against the railing, gaze searching for her own path. Seren stood at the far end, haunted but unbroken. Elara lifted her face to the aurora unfurling green fire above. She said the Ice Queen loved, and the world did not end, it began. Lucas touched her hand and silence held them, vast, eternal, unshaken.